We all remember the Mersey sound, don't we? No, not that one. This one. Britain's first rock and roll poetry book. The one that Penguin Books published in May 1967, the same year as Sgt. Pepper. But instead of Paul, John, George and Ringo, there was Adrian, Roger and Brian. 2 teachers and a schoolboy who were making poetry cool.
This is not what we came to see.
The world of poetry has never been the same again. As we all know, before the 60s, Britain was in black and white. Everyone spoke like this.
Today the town is calm and the police say that everything's under control.
And to understand poetry, you had to have a degree in Latin. Fortunately, the swinging decade brought colour to Britain's cheeks. Regional people were allowed on the telly.
Yeah, we don't all speak like the BBC.
We don't all speak like that, do we?
Right, come up north.
And the centre of the cultural universe moved 200 miles north of London to Liverpool. The city hit all the headlines, especially when the Beatles topped the US charts. And respectable London publishers Penguin Books came on the hunt for new poets to sign. They found 3 maverick poets who were packing out gigs on the Liverpool circuit, performing a new brand of Scouse beat poetry. Their poems read like song lyrics and told stories about everyday life in the city, getting drunk and having it off with strangers on one-night stands.
Love is the presents in the Christmas shops. Love is when you're feeling top of the pops. Love is what happens when the music stops. Love is...
All those damsels in distress, half undressed or even less, the bat pill makes them all say, yes, Batman.
My bus conductor tells me he only has one kidney, and that makes you... Sorry about this, I can't help laughing. Can't help laughing in the face of medical disaster.
Penguin took a punt and signed the trio. And in May 1967, the Mersey Sound anthology hit the stores. It was an overnight smash hit and has stayed in print for over 50 years.
When the book came out, it was supposed to be like the first print was supposed to last for ages, but in fact it sold out.
It struck a chord with our generation when our generation was young, open, and it was the right time.
Those of us who did A-level English literature in the sixth form, you know, if we read Keats, we were sort of told that was the way to write. So if suddenly somebody writes about panties lying all forlorn or you top of the pops or chip shops, what? How can that be poetry?
I just read it from cover to cover and suddenly I was transported into a completely different world. I'd no idea that poetry like this existed. And it was the missing link between the cautionary tales of Hilaire Belloc and the first Clash album.
It was given to me by my school teacher, and it was almost magazine-y, if you know what I mean, and the poetry was instantly accessible. It felt cool. When you looked at it, wow, this is cool.
It was the politics and the directness and the fact they were talking about, you know, sex and war and rock and roll.
Reading the Mersey poets, it was about me and us in our place. I hadn't got in a truck and gone down Route 66, but I'd gone up the M6.
At the start of the 60s, you weren't anyone unless you wore bright colours and were in a band. Conscription was over and a new generation were looking for a party. And Liverpool was party central. And while music fans were screaming at bands in the cavern, poetry was also moving to a different beat in a hip new part of town called Liverpool 8. This once run-down area was like Soho, Paris and New York, on the Mersey.
Doric columns supporting peeling entablatures, dirty windows out of Vitruvius concealing families of happy Jamaicans, sullen out-of-work Irishmen, poets, queers, thieves, painters, university students, lovers.
And like any rundown area worth its salt, it was hipster central.
I was drawn to Liverpool 8, and it seemed to be full of interesting people. Beautiful girls, long-haired girls, beatniks, and very fashionable people, and just so much going on. I was really drawn to it in the way that young people today are drawn to where they consider to be the hip place to be.
Liverpool 8 was fantastic to find cheap digs. It was kind of bohemian. It was like Liverpool's left bank. You could just get the sense looking back of it being a real ferment.
It was always a bit rough, bit edgy, bit dangerous sometimes on occasions, but also with that lovely kind of bohemian feel to it.
The beatnik culture with its coffee bars and polo necks was all the rage in 60s New York, and it had found a home on the banks of the Mersey.
We can't talk about Mersey Sound without bringing coffee into it. And there was these coffee bars. Just go there for late night coffee, 10 o'clock in the evening, and have coffee and talk about the world, put the world to rights. So I was aware of poetry readings in Liverpool, a place called Streets, and they used to have poetry and jazz evenings. I remember going to some of those, and then starting to read my poems. A lonely lady with perfumed hair is eating primly and with care, lest she should drop a bean onto a clean, suitable skirt and ruin the illusion of sophistication.
Head beatnik on the Liverpool 8 scene was local art teacher, the late, great Adrian Henry.
My name is Adrian Henry. I'm 34 years of age, white, of no fixed religion, born in Birkenhead, a town of shipyards and sooty terrace houses.
Adrian was primarily a painter who came to poetry rather late, wrote it secretively at first, and I guess because a lot of the poems are images, you know, and may even have been notes for paintings.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm just Adrian Henry, and anything that I'm technically capable of making, I'd like to make.
I want to paint 2,000 dead birds crucified on a background of night. Pictures that tramps can live in. Pictures that children would find in their stockings on Christmas morning. Pictures that teenage lovers can send each other. I want to paint pictures.
Hang on a minute. Poets are poets and painters are painters. How can you be a painter and a poet? Yes, you can. And that was, in its own way, quite, exciting. I mean, Michelangelo was a poet and a painter. Why shouldn't you be?
I'd seen Adrian Henry around before I got talking to him. We used to travel on the same bus, going to different schools. We're both teaching. And I remember distinctly him being at the very front of the bus, turning around to face everybody so he could talk to his friends on the seat behind him. He would be lecturing us all on Rauschenberg and full of enthusiasms about people I'd never heard of. And it's interesting. It's worth missing a few buses to get on the one that Adrian was on.
Adrian and Roger were a marriage made in beat heaven, both working by day as teachers and by night as poets about town. Meanwhile, 15-year-old Brian Patton had left school and was working as a cub reporter for local rag The Bootle Times, covering some pretty urgent news of the day.
What in fact was the tone?
A sort of Vicar's garden parties which you attended, stoned out your mind and smiled at Vicar's and that, you know, that kind of thing, you know.
As a what? A
junior reporter, you know.
After a particularly good night on the tiles, Brian came up with one of the earliest poems in the Mersey Sound.
In the condemned houses up on Brownlow Hill in Liverpool, there was lots of parties. I'd walked some lass home. She was getting a bus. And walking home, I wrote Party Piece on the back of a Woodbine packet.
He said, let's stay here. Now this place is emptied and make gentle pornography with one another, while the partygoers go out and dawn creeps in like a stranger.
Let us not hesitate over what we know or over how cold this place has become, but let's unclip our minds and let tumble free the mad, mangled crocodiles of love.
So they did, right there among the woodbines and the Guinness stains. And later, he caught a bus and she caught a train. And all there was between them then was rain.
You know, I think everyone has lived that poem at some stage or other. In your early teens.
You know, I don't know, maybe someone else would read it and say, oh, this is just a guy using his poetry to get his leg over. I don't know.
It was about rain and loss and unrequited love, as well as anything, as well as the all-night parties, yeah. It was one of the first poems I wrote that I thought, gosh, where did that come from?
Brian started scouring the newspaper ads for kindred spirits.
In the Liverpool Echo, there was a little advert that said, meet Pete the Beat at Streets. It fascinated me, I didn't know what it meant. I went down into this basement and there were, it's just a whole different world down there. Hide me school cat. I'd met a lass who introduced me to Roger and Adrian, and she said I didn't look like a poet, but they were proper poets. I think it was because they were that much older, really.
I read when I had some of this journalists from the British Times downstairs, I was expecting this hard-bitten, tough 40-year-old, when I found this hard-bitten, tough 16-year-old.
Brian was a phenomenon. When he first came and started reciting poetry, he was 15. And it was extraordinary. We just were completely blown away by that.
This is the projectionist's nightmare. A bird finds its way into a cinema, finds the beam, flies down it, smashes into a screen depicting a garden, a sunset, and two people being nice to one another.
His poems are always good from the word go. He'd come back one day and had written like 3 classic poems, I remember. Then bloody hell, where's that come from?
The Liverpool poets were riffing on a style of performance poetry laid down by the American beat poets. Stateside figures like Allen Ginsberg had revolutionised the public view of poetry. Beat mania hit UK shores with gusto, and every emerging poet wanted to be beat.
There were poets of our age writing poems about being in New York, and the landscape of New York became part of their poems, jumping into a yellow cab on 52nd Street and meeting so-and-so and all this happening. And they'd never been to New York.
The Liverpool poets did it their way. They created Scouse Beat.
We took great pride in writing about Liverpool. So when we wrote poems about going down Lime Street and describing St George's Hall as a coal man's wedding cake, because it was all black full of dust, and all the Chinese restaurants on Lime Street had bouncers outside. And I remember people saying that's not poetry, because poetry can't be written about a place like Liverpool.
Adrian was clear that the poet must have his own voice, read in his own voice, write in his own voice. And he was always a bit dismissive of British poets who were so enamored with the American beats that they felt that they had to read in a mock American accent, that was the voice of the new poetry.
After breakfast, which is usually coffee and a view of teeming rain in a cathedral old and grey but smelling good with grass and ferns. How many are flies sulking behind these windows, from basement to attic, complaining and asking, who will inherit me today? Who will I share breakfast with? And always the same answer coming back, the rain will inherit you, lonely breakfaster.
Thanks to the likes of William Wordsworth, poetry and the public imagination involved rural idyls of one type or another. So to romanticise the Victorian splendour of a northern town and the municipal gardens therein was a very... that stuff had never been really taught up, not in the north anyway. Any artist worth the name will find romance in the city. And things that other people might have thought unsightly were often the trigger of some sublime work.
Sometimes I feel like a priest in a fish and chip queue, quietly thinking as the vinegar runs through, how nice it will be to buy supper for two.
The sense of humour, the playing with words was a very Liverpool thing, and it captured the essence of the city in the way it used the language, you know.
Running words together, trying to capture the way they sounded, trying to capture the rhythm of the way that people actually talked.
Adrian Henry, Brian Patton and Roger McGough were the new wave, and they did do something to make it less of a middle-class sort of preserve.
The three poets packed in the crowds at pop-up venues around town.
Liverpool became a performed space. You could find poetry and art and music in so many of the kind of hollowed out spaces of commerce. So the cavern was an old cellar that was used for storing goods. The Liverpool poets, they were far more interested in just meeting people who drink in places like this and hitting them with a poem.
I think that is the only way to appreciate poetry. I'm absolutely dogmatic about this. It's a phonetic medium. If it doesn't sound any good, it's because it isn't any good.
The element of performance was crucial from the beginning, because when they met, it was to perform poems. What was important was that there was a moment which followed very closely the moment of writing. There was a moment where that writing was being shared with an audience, which wasn't an audience that you would find in a university amphitheatre. They had a pint glass in their hand.
Thank you, and the first of our Tuesday night people tonight is Roger McGough, poet extraordinary and veteran of 1,000 readings.
God bless all the policemen and fighters of crime. May thieves go to jail for a very long time. They've had a hard day helping clean up the town. Now they hang from the mantelpiece, both upside down. A glass of warm blood and then straight up the stairs, Batman and Robin are saying their prayers.
It's funny because I've always been a rather nervous performer and a quite shy sort of person, but I think it was fun doing readings, trying things out and getting a response from an audience.
I used to read appallingly. I used to kind of declaim the poems. It was appalling. And of course I was nervous, you know. I used to shout them more than read them.
It'd be nice if you could save those little claps. You may need them later.
If you were in this place at that time, on that day of the week, this is what you were there for. It was jammed out.
A lot of the young people were the same people that went to the cavern. And I remember George and Ringo turning up at one of the readings in Hope Hall. So things were kind of very connected and everybody knew everybody, you know.
The light was already shining very brightly on Liverpool because of the Beatles. The poets grabbed it and ran with it and made it a movement that young people felt belonged to them.
You didn't feel as though you were at like a poetry recital. You felt like you were at a rock gig. There was a real sort of sensibility, a sort of pop sensibility about the whole thing.
I had this sort of double life when I was a teacher, wearing my corduroy jacket. But I always carried this bag around with me, and then I'd have a poetry reading at night, so I'd go into I like to think I used to go into a telephone box and transform myself into a beat poet by putting on a polo neck, black polo neck jumper and comb my hair forward and go off clutching my poems into the night like a sort of super poet. And of course, I used to go into Liverpool 8, do a reading, or go to the pub, or see my friends, go to club. Buses stopped at 11 o'clock at night, I suppose, in those days, so I'd had lots of friends with accommodating sofas. And if you're lucky, you copped off. Come Close and Sleep Now, an early love poem. And it's about a little love affair or a one-night stand, and it brings in sort of Catholic guilt that I've nourished all my life. It is afterwards, and you talk on tiptoe, happy to be part of the darkness, lips becoming limp, a prelude to tiredness. Come close and sleep now, for in the morning, when a policeman disguised as a son creeps into the room, and your mother, disguised as birds, calls from the trees, you will put on a dress of guilt and shoes with broken high ideals, and refusing coffee, run all the way home.
In true rock star fashion, Brian Patton was more than happy to smash up a few poetry classics along the way. He started at the top with Victorian poet Tennyson and his revered classic Maud, which Brian decided was in need of a Mary Quant makeover.
I really wanted to try and write something about what was happening to Maud now, you know, and I had the idea of this young teenage girl lost in the back streets of Liverpool. And that's how it came about, really, as a reaction against the Tennyson poem.
Maud? Where are you, Maud? With your long dresses and peach cream complexion. In what cage did you hang up that black bat at night? What took place in the garden? Maud, it's over, you can tell us now.
He said, well, where are you now, Maud? What are you up to? How dare he? It's just a nerve to do that. And I think I felt envious, actually. Now I'm thinking about it. When I looked at it, I thought, wow. You know, it's a Yiddish word, chutzpah. You know, how did you have the chutzpah to do that? Sheesh.
Can it be that you got yourself lost and are living with an out-of-work musician? You share a furnished room and have an old wireless that tells you the latest bad news. What's happening, Maud? What's happening? Yeah, but yeah, fabulous, great poem.
Why not tell the kids what poetry really is? Why not tell them what it's about? Why not explain that sort of poets get drunk and poets make love and that poets live just like anyone else, you know?
Brian's revamped take on Maud spoke right to the heart of 60s Britain, desperate for change. For their city, like many others, was rising from the rubble of World War II.
Liverpool was almost wiped off the map by the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. Blitz Liverpool would have been very much part of their lives and their parents' lives, and it would have just been in the kind of collective memory of the city.
One of Adrian's earliest memories, visual memories, was the Mersey on fire. You can't say you've got that as your first memory and then have no darkness in you a bit later.
And I saw death in Upper Duke Street, cloak flapping black tall Batman collar, striding tall shoulders down the hill past the cathedral, brown shoes slightly down his heel.
My earliest memories were of bombs falling, and used to have these barrage balloons over the tops of the houses, big silver. I thought them like silver elephants. And our red siren would go, and we'd get us out of bed, put on our dressing gowns. Used to go under the stairs, very small cupboard, where there's a cot, and we used to go in there. Dad would take us in there, and my sister and I would lie at the bottom. My mum would lie on top of us, and my dad would lie on top of us. And the sirens going, and bombs falling. Mother, the wardrobe was full of infantrymen. I asked them, but they snarled, saying it was a man's life. Mother, there is a Centurion tank in the parlour. I asked the officer, but he laughed, saying, Queen's regulations. Piano was out of tune anyway. I went for a policeman, but they were looting the town. I went for a fire engine, but they're all upside down. I went for a priest, but they're all on their knees. Mother, don't just lie there. Say something, please. Mother, don't just lie there. Say something, please. I was born in North Liverpool, near the docks. My father worked on the docks all his life. I was always brought up to think I was lucky. Lucky to be born in Liverpool. You're lucky to be a Catholic. I was lucky to be anything. Looking back on it, it's funny because we were very poor.
I grew up in a terrace house in Wavertree in Liverpool with my gran and my grandfather and my mother. All around us were houses made unsafe by bombs. Our playgrounds were the back alleys and the wastelands and the derelict houses that the Luftwaffe had destroyed. What I remember best about the house was lying in bed at night listening to the foghorns on the Mersey. I always used to imagine there were dinosaurs going ooh, ooh, like wandering in the back streets of the town, you know. The house I grew up in was very unhappy. You know, there wasn't much conversation in the house. People didn't communicate much with each other. And I used to scribble poems or just bits and pieces of writing when I was about 11 or so. It was a way to try and articulate what I felt for myself.
This morning, being rather young and foolish, I borrowed a machine gun my father had left hidden since the war, went out and eliminated a number of small enemies. Since then, I've not returned home. This morning, sitting alone in a strange playground, muttering, you've blundered, over and over to myself. I work out my next move, but cannot move. The tracker dogs will sniff me out. I have my lollipops.
There's always a shock element in quite a few of their poems. So you've got, I borrowed a machine gun. Straight away, what do you mean you borrowed a machine gun? You're a poet, you couldn't have borrowed a machine gun. And then that my father left behind. Well, as with a lot of Brian Patton's poems, there's a dream element that you realise when you sort of just got into the poem that you could be in a dream, or you are in a dream, or you're in a fantasy. And so you get this wonderful thing where they're very, very real, concrete things going on. You've got lollipops and tracker dogs, but they're in the dream. And he says, in a strange playground. That reminds us that it's an estranged world that he keeps writing about, these dream sequences. It's surrealism updated in a way that you hardly notice it's surrealism. And what's interesting with these three is that they've given surrealism a new lease of life by discovering it in the mix of the popular culture, the memories and dreams they had, and the world they were living in.
Dinosaur ferries and flying elephants were nothing compared to the surrealist mind journeys of painter-poet Adrian Henry.
Adrian Henry wrote about this idea of the inner museum, the kind of museum of the imagination, where you move through life and you collect influences and you don't control where those influences come from or how they collide, but they create their own order inside you, and actually that's what you find yourself pouring out onto the page.
Tonight at noon, supermarkets will advertise 3p extra on everything. Tonight at noon, Children from happy families will be sent to live in a home. Elephants will tell each other human jokes. America will declare peace on Russia. World War I generals will sell poppies in the streets on November the 11th. The first daffodils of autumn will appear when the leaves fall upwards to the trees.
What the poems do is take Liverpool as a base, a kind of a set on which anything can happen. That's the sense of magic. So I was getting to know those places, but always with Adrian Henry's voice in the back of my head and his fantasy version of those places as well. You know, the prostitutes like snowmen in the middle of Canning Street. There's the one about, I think it's a spy staggering down Little St. Bride Street, and he collapses into a yard full of whitewashing.
Adrian's surrealist partner in crime was a character called Père Ubu, borrowed from the 19th century French symbolist Alfred Jarry.
Père Ubu is the incarnation of all human vices. I see him as a very Liverpool kind of figure, rather like me, and I imagine him in familiar situations like crossing Lime Street drunk in the afternoon or walking on real sands.
I have seen Père Ubu walking across Lime Street and Alfred Jarry cycling down Elliot Street, and Marcel Proust in the Cardoma, eating Madeleine butties dipped in tea.
These are the very beginnings of pop art in Britain. The idea that you could look at the environment around you and use that as material for your art, rather than pastoral landscapes and daffodils. For Adrian, high and low culture weren't really two separate realms, that they just ran into each other, and that a Michelangelo or a chewing gum wrapper would be part of culture.
I don't really recognise a barrier between the arts particularly, and I'm very interested by anything that gets over the barrier between art forms.
Adrian was about to create the ultimate collage, a show which combined poetry with all the artistic forms he could get his hands on.
Adrian said, I'm organising this thing in Liverpool and it's going to be like a happening, like one of the New York happenings. We're calling it an event. And it's, well, that was it. He said, if you want to play your sax or read some poetry or whatever, get involved.
In New York, the happenings had been happening since the 1950s in the form of unrehearsed multimedia arts performances. Now they were taking place in Liverpool.
The first happening that Adrian staged, he designed this environment made of old posters, advertising posters, slashes of paint, abstract expressionist style.
And it was a kind of whole environment of poetry and paintings that Adrian had created, and music.
Girls from the art college would join in and do installation things or little dance team things.
They were just little theatrical events, really, involving music and poetry and visuals.
There's one happening, an early one, 1962-63, which there's a manuscript for, or rather a typescript. It's a sheet of paper, an A4 sheet of paper, with a poem by Brian. And on the right-hand side is this column that says, Adrian paints a heart, Adrian paints, da-da-da, Adrian moves. So it's almost like your script, where on the left you have the words and on the right you have the visuals. And what's quite nice also is that on that particular sheet of paper there's like splatters of paint, and it's pretty obvious that Adrian had splattered the paint and it had gone on to Brian's manuscript.
I didn't really understand what was happening at the happenings, but they were happening.
In addition to Adrian's flair for visual theatrics, the poets tapped into that famous Liverpudlian wit, helped along by Roger's involvement in comedy trio The Scaffold.
Are you, Nixon, up to his usual tricks? A junkie pilot taking a fix.
The Scaffold were Roger, John Gorman, and Mike McGear, a.k.a. McCartney, yes, brother of Paul. So there's your Beatles connection right there.
Make you
a church from the night sky.
The scaffold would do surrealist comedy routines well ahead of Monty Python, I might say.
Are your politicians lusting for power? Are you asleep at the 11th hour?
Didn't you used to go out with her?
In the basement of the Everyman, home to many of the happenings, Roger and Brian are giving one of their sketches a dusting off.
A lot of people have been concerned recently about the rise in poetry, particularly amongst teenagers. Slim volumes can now be bought openly in certain parts of the country. And it's become fashionable for people to gather together in groups and be turned on by verse. One such victim has volunteered bravely, I think, to shamble along here this evening and discuss his problem. Of course, he wishes to remain anonymous. So would you welcome, please, Mr. Brian Patton.
Hi, Roger.
Brian. Brian, now tell me, when did it all first begin?
Well, at school, yeah.
Oh, really? As early as that?
Yeah, I saw some of the older boys doing it and I looked at a bit of harmless fun.
Bit of harmless fun.
Yeah.
What sort of things were you experimenting with in those early days?
Oh, the usual stuff, the pastiches and the parodies and the pale imitations.
Oh, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What about sonnets?
Sonnets, you know, Roger, I was doing 14 lines a night.
14 lines a night?
Yeah. Sometimes 15.
15,
yeah.
my God. Right, was there no one could see the damage you're doing to yourself and tried to help you break out of this habit?
A few critics said I ought to stop doing it, yeah, but by then I was hopelessly addicted. I was onto metaphysics.
Brian, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll go and push them now, Roger.
Okay. Please go.
In case sketches and painting weren't your thing, the poets added music to their arsenal.
The big revolutionary thing with the Mersey poets, the Liverpool poets, was they performed poetry to rock and roll. That was absolutely crucial. And it's interesting that you saw a lot of working class men embracing poetry.
Adrian read poems and wrote poems like a musician. I mean, he'd never played an instrument, washboard, that was about it. But he totally understood music and felt for it.
Although, of course, the thing that Adrian really wanted to be was the lead singer in a rock and roll band.
John Peel said that Adrian was the greatest non-singer he'd seen. And I remember him doing concerts and where he'd lie on the floor and put his feet up in the air and waggle himself, and this big, rotund fella.
Evening. Take me back to Gotham City, Batman. Take me where the girls are pretty, Batman. All those damsels in distress, half undressed or even less. The bat pill makes them all say yes, Batman.
Go on, Adrian. Well, Liverpool is Gotham City. You look at the liver buildings. That's straight out of Batman. You know, honestly, I mean, the liver buildings are so Batman, it's untrue. I mean, Liverpool always felt like Gotham City to me. And and we did have our own superheroes at the time as well, you know. A lot of villains as well. But we had our own superheroes, you know, the Beatles were heroes, and Roger and Brian, and they were like heroes to us all.
This idea that the bat pill makes them all say yes sounds like a celebration of 60s culture, free love, etc., etc. But then in the next verse, he goes, help us out in Vietnam, Batman. Help us drop that bat napalm, Batman. So you sort of almost lull your audience into a sense of full security. This is the 60s. It's fun with the sex bit. And then you hit them with, do we really want Batman to drop the bat napalm? I mean, this is irony.
Whenever you're talking about a big subject like the 60s, it's very easy to mythologise music and politics and culture and love and sex and feminism. You know, all these things were sort of bubbling over each other. One key element that is very easy to overlook was the Vietnam War. 1 minute you could be singing the Beach Boys, And the next minute, you could be looking at the television and seeing that awful picture of the Vietnamese girl with no clothes running down the road with bombs going off all around her. And that could be side by side. You could be listening to the Beach Boys while you looked at that. Poetry could talk about this. They discovered, these guys, that you could clip a bit of a comic, you could clip a bit of Vietnam, you could clip a bit of being in bed with your girlfriend, and it's all in the same verse, never mind the same poem.
I think they could write a poetry of rapid response. You know, they were kind of reacting to events unfolding. You know, it's answering back and it's spreading the news.
I think there's a darkness in all three, and that darkness is by necessity present in their work because it is present in their world.
I think it's a big mistake to just regard this book as the kind of scribblings of three carefree troubadours, a whimsical book. I mean, it contains whimsy, but it has edges and corners and shadows.
There was the optimism with the anxiety. And, of course, the big anxiety was the bomb.
It's hard to imagine now, but the standoff between Russia and America, Khrushchev and Kennedy, was very, very real. People did feel very, very close to a Third World War. I mean, you know, it was very, very spooky.
You know, it was a kind of pet subject with everybody, wasn't it? You know, the mushroom cloud, you know, live for the moment. There might not be no future. There still is. I mean, no future is it's a very, you know, that kind of raw existentialism is always attractive to the young.
A little satellite, it fell out of the sky one day. It landed in the ocean not very far away. The general at the radar screen, he rubbed his hands with glee, and then he pressed the button that started World War III.
It seemed it could happen any time, and imagination takes over. So you're dealing with it. So one of the poems I wrote, Icarus all sorts, licorice all sorts, Icarus, of course, falling from the sky. And it uses a lot of nursery rhymes. A little bit of heaven fell from out the sky one day. It was a popular song at the time. It landed in the ocean not so very far away.
The poems that were directly against war and directly against oppression and class injustice immediately struck a chord with me. I mean, I always thought Roger was the one who was most political, with a small p. And he was political in a playful, interesting, clever way.
When the bus stopped suddenly to avoid damaging a mother and child on the road, the young lady in the green hat sitting opposite was thrown across me. And not being one to miss an opportunity, I started to make love. At first she resisted, saying it was too early in the morning and too soon after breakfast, and anyway, she found me repulsive. But when I explained that this being a nuclear age, the world was going to end at lunchtime, she took off her green hat, put a bus ticket in her pocket, and join in the exercise.
I saw a directness, a kind of social realism. I mean, you know, and a social surrealism, because you take what is going on and then you give it a humorous or weird twist to turn it into entertainment. And that's what I saw them doing.
Roger's writing this almost, well, apparently really silly poem about, you know, somebody's on the bus and somebody says the world's going to end at lunchtime and everybody starts making love to each other and all. That's almost ridiculous and silly and whimsical. And then you think, gosh, you know, these guys were worried about the bomb.
The 60s was a time of protest, and the Mersey sound gave voice to a generation taking to the streets.
Most people don't care about poetry because most poetry doesn't care about people. The poetry of the Liverpool poets cared deeply about people.
I certainly get a sense that they weren't writing for kind of the elites. They weren't writing to show how clever they were. They were writing poetry that the marginalised could connect with. What they do have is empathy with people, and that's honest.
These were artists that were not divorced from the newspapers. It is something that gives their humour more texture.
Brian Patton's ironic poem, White Smethwick, took on one of the most racist election campaigns in Britain's history.
When I read Brian Patton's poem, White Smethwick, I'd never heard white people talk about black people in that way.
There were race riots in Smethwick in Birmingham because the Conservative Party were playing a race card to try and win votes.
The Tory party had people like Enoch Powell in it who were kind of respected and given a lot of room to say what they wanted to say and spread their racism.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
There was a campaign during the election that says, if you want a nigger for your neighbour, vote Labour. It was a very frightening time, you know, to be growing up and, you know, your parents saying, well, you can't go to this part and you can't go to that part. You can go in that shop, but you can't go in that shop.
I'd simply taken out a pencil and on the edge of the newspaper began scribbling a poem. I'm dreaming of a white Smethwick, one I didn't want to know. They'll have all white, all bright children, and the white and white minstrel show. Strange men came to Smethwick with slogans whitewashed on their minds. They campaigned about a while, then left their ship behind. The last blackbird's been shot in Smethwick, and the council's doing all right. The MPs in the Commons making sure his words are white.
White Smethwick for me was an interesting and inspirational poem because, I mean, I'm from a Sussex port town which was completely white then and still is really now, but I was aware of the growing influx of people of colour from the Caribbean at that time especially. And I was aware, of course, of racism and fascism in certain areas of the country. I remember cycling when I was, you know, in my teens, singing to myself, I'm dreaming of a white Smethwick when I didn't want to know.
We were from a community that lived together in Liverpool 8. It wasn't at all divided in a sense, you know. And it was quite a horrible thing for the Conservative government to be doing.
I was writing poetry, you know, that was a kind of trying to oppose, you know, the white male kind of narrative. But suddenly it was three white men who I could identify with.
They were very good at voicing their disquiet and their concern about our elected classes so early on.
The politicians, who are buying huge cars with hobnailed wheels the size of merry-go-rounds, have a new plan.
They're going to put cobbles in our eye sockets and pebbles in our navels and fill us up with asphalt and lay us side by side so that we can take a more active part in the road to destruction.
That's an uncommonly downbeat piece for Roger, isn't it?
Evidence that fuck all's changed.
And these kind of like, you know, ideas that you can like, you know, you can talk about politics, you can talk about the people that govern us in a way that makes you think, yeah, bastards.
They were indeed the people's poets. Their political musings chimed with a wider beat poetry movement that was gaining popularity. But the secret ingredient of the Liverpool poets was always pop.
They were very interested in finding the largest possible audience for their work and in making their work about encounter and in making their work also about part of something a lot bigger, so music as well as poetry and the audience joining in even. You know, this was kind of radical stuff, I think, in the 60s. So pop in every sense of the word, yeah.
Their fame was growing, reaching the ears of the world's most celebrated beat poet, Allen Ginsberg.
The dry-lipped diplomat, the hairy teacher, will come out of me again, shitting the meat out of my ears on my cancer deathbed.
He decided to pay a visit and check out his Scouse counterparts.
When Allen came up, he declared the place the centre of the consciousness of the human universe. But then wherever Alan was the centre of the consciousness of the human universe, you know?
Creation, destruction, and ganja.
Adrian actually found him with a pinion doing the washing up. Can you imagine Allen Ginsberg with a pinion doing the washing up? Anyway, there you go.
So he ended up being taken out, going to readings, doing readings, giving readings, meeting poets, meeting musicians, and generally making quite a lot of friends. People seem to be quite taken with this American. Adrian took Alan to Everton, and Alan saw a graffiti that said, "Billy Blake is fab." And of course, Allen Ginsberg, being such a fan of William Blake, was very excited by this message. You know, Billy Blake was fab as far as he was concerned. And that moment triggered a poem which Adrian wrote called "Mrs. Albion, You've Got a Lovely Daughter."
Albion's most lovely daughter sat on the banks of the Mersey, dangling her landing stage in the water. The daughters of Albion, arriving by underground at Central Station, eating hot Eccles cakes at the pierhead, writing "Billy Blake is fab" on a wall in Matthew Street. Well, it's incredible, that Billy Blake thing, because when I first, I didn't realise for ages that it was an allusion to William Blake. Duh! Because it's such a great Liverpool scally lad name. Billy Blake, all right, mate.
The daughters of Albion, taking the dawn ferry to tomorrow. Beautiful boys with bright red guitars in the spaces in between the stars. Reeling and a rocking, wishing and a hoping, kissing and a praying, loving and a laying. Mrs. Albion, you got a lovely daughter.
Liverpool had indeed become the centre of the universe, and everyone wanted a piece of it.
There'd be film crews, filming film crews, filming film crews, filming someone coming out of the cabin.
I mean, it was a media feeding frenzy in Liverpool at that time. They all wanted to know what was the next best thing.
Time then for publishing giants Penguin to head to Liverpool in search of a poetry boy band.
This was publishing catching up with the energy, with the spoken word and written energy that was in Liverpool.
Penguin in '66 wrote a letter to Adrian saying, you know, I've looked at Brian's and Roger's work, and looking at yours now, I'm convinced that we have a Liverpool volume.
We were contacted by Penguin. A chap called Tony Richardson got in touch. To receive a letter inviting us to be part of the Penguin Modern Poet series was really very exciting.
Just pure fluke that the spotlight fell on those Liverpool poets, I think. It's quite humbling, and it's lovely to have been able to do something like that.
The publishers had their band, now for the album cover. In a radical departure from their usual black and white covers, they came up with a bold new design to appeal to a pop audience.
This was probably one of the first Penguin Modern Poets to have such a strong image rather than just the names of the poets. And when you look at the graphics, it's black, red, very striking. You've got on the right-hand side, you've got faces of people screaming, so there's this kind of Beatlemania association.
So apart from anything else, before we even opened the book, it reeked of modernity. And I really mean up-to-the-minute modernity. So that in itself was a sort of grabber, if you like.
But not everyone was happy.
The critics, unfortunately, were also poets, and of course, they found it difficult to have any generosity of spirit. What they were writing was poetry, and what we were writing wasn't.
I mean, people referred to laughingly as the three-headed pantomime horse from Liverpool, and things like that. And it's not worth the ink that's written with.
A mere flash in the pan, the Times 1967.
There is a general air of being pleased with silly puns, and in subdued moments, the diction of Tin Pan Alley is as suddenly obvious as a smell. Times Literary Supplements.
The fact that Liverpool people believe that their bad poetry is different from other bad poetry
does not make it so. The Observer.
They were criticising working people for believing that they could actually tell what poetry was or that they could enjoy it.
It was of the young, what they were doing, you know. It was not about a crusty, self-promoting, self-protective, literary establishment. There was none of that.
To this day, poetry has, unfortunately, still a pretty appalling reputation for elitism and being basically up its own arse. The poetry establishment, or the harbingers of taste, almost along the lines of, if it's popular and you're talking about what's happening now, it isn't really poetry.
Proving that critics are generally wrong, the book became an instant smash hit. To date, it has sold over 500,000 copies and remains every bit the chart topper Penguin hoped for.
If the Mersey Sound was an album, Let Me Die a Young Man's Death would be the hit single off it.
Let me die a young man's death.
Not a clean and in between the sheets holy water death.
Not a famous last words, peaceful out of breath death.
When I'm 73 and in constant good humour.
May I be mowed down at dawn by a bright red sports car on my way home from an all-night party.
Or when I'm 104 and banned from the cavern. May my mistress, catching me in bed with her daughter and fearing for her son, cut me up into little pieces and throw away every piece but one. Let me die a young man's death, not a free from sin, tiptoe in, candle wax and waning death, not a curtains drawn, by angels born. What a nice way to go, death. It's funny, isn't it, how quickly we become the past. What would the younger MacGuff think of me? Perhaps pleased that you carried on doing what you started off doing then. It's strange how a young man wrote those poems. I can sense that man. I think what he's trying to do, and I sort of quite like him.
Without being conceited, I mean, I think the three of us have broadened out the audience of poetry in Britain, and established the idea that poetry reading is a form of entertainment, that if you're running a festival, you wouldn't not have poets appearing in it and things. You know?
When I was a schoolboy, I bent down to tie my shoelace, and then when I looked up, over 50 years had passed. I mean, living here now, looking at this fantastic landscape I'm living in, I'm still a child in Sefton Park. All the poems of mine in the Mersey Sound are poems I wrote when I was in my teens. And of course, there are things in them that now I would go back and change. But it would be wrong to, really, because the person who wrote them, the young person who wrote them, wouldn't like me looking over the shoulder. He'd say, bugger off, let me write it. I'm the poet, not you.
Changes to our evening now on BBC4. A great continental railway journey is next. Then, in half an hour, a tribute to Tom Petty with a performance from 1980. And you can see Henry VIII, patron or plunderer, at the new time of 11:15. And for more from our poetry season, Contains Strong Language, go online for details of programmes across BBC TV, radio and iPlayer.